Bruce Delteil, the managing partner of McKinsey. Just 2 minutes and we'll get set up. Bruce is a good friend of mine. Bruce, there you are. He was the 14th guest on my show almost 2 years ago. I was quite surprised to get Bruce on the show, actually, but you're here now. Take a seat, Bruce. Go. Okay, Bruce. How many of you out there know a music producer or you are a music producer? Could I just get a show of hands here? Okay, Bruce would love to talk to you because for the last 2 years he's been asking me nonstop for a music producer recommendation because little do you know, besides being managing partner of McKinsey, he's also a musician. Is that right, Bruce?
Actually, that's probably the biggest publicity I had today about this. Yeah, no, I'm actually also a recording artist, and COVID actually didn't help in continuing on that path. And now that I'm in Vietnam, I'm looking at doing this even more. So very happy to connect with whoever is involved.
Cool.
Thank you.
Music
and good
producer,
morning, everyone.
You guys heard it. There you go. Bruce, it's been almost 2 years ago since we did the podcast. And before we go into today's topic, which is about net zero goals, I'd just like to review how your 2 years, the last 2 years have been. We've done the show many times. Vietcetera has gone through a lot of evolutions. But I'd like to hear what's changed for McKinsey and for you since then. What are some big highlights and milestones that you can kind of share with the audience today?
Thank you, Hal. But before we get into McKinsey, I just want to congratulate you and Vietcetera for the achievement over the past 2 years, because this is amazing. And
thank you.
So I'm very happy to be connected to this. It's always now become a bit of a tricky question, what has been happening over the past 2 years, because there's been this fantastic period of growth and confidence, and then something is happening now, which is to some extent slowing down a few things that we didn't necessarily predict. But otherwise, for natural reasons, such as Vietnam being one of the only countries to go through the COVID crisis by continuing to have a positive GDP growth and all this. I mean, obviously that has pushed and pulled quite a number of economic activities in the country. And then for us, that has also meant that a lot of players, whether they are on the public sector side or on the private sector side, were very much eager to do something new. And from a McKinsey perspective, I think we pivoted from something that was more, strategy, which is, okay, what should be my plan for the next 5-10 years, to how do I transform? And this transformation topic, which we see across sectors, has really been at the core of everything that we've been doing. And therefore that has led for McKinsey in the country to embrace this transformative change and adapt to it. So as an example, we used to have one large office in Hanoi and a smaller office in Ho Chi Minh City. Now it's about half-half, which we're very happy. But also more recently, we've built a digital hub of 70 people, actually based here in Ho Chi Minh City, that are working alongside our clients to build digital products and services. Because McKinsey today, not only in Vietnam, but in the rest of the world,
right.
It's strategy organization, which is the part that most people know, but it's also implementation of those transformation projects and building digital services and products, and sometimes building digital businesses altogether.
Right.
So that's what has been happening.
Okay, yeah, I noticed online you guys are hiring everything from product managers to software engineers, so
right.
Not just the strategy, but the implementation as well. Maybe you could share about the growth in the headcount. I mean, when I met you, you guys were 30, maybe 40 staff. You're probably close to 200 now. I mean, maybe you can't disclose the exact figures, but it's quite the growth.
I think we were 35 early 2019. We are now close to 180.
Okay.
Yeah, which I'm very, very happy with.
Okay.
And that helps us actually support our clients even more.
Gotcha. What for you is most remarkable in those 2 years about Vietnam's resiliency? And how does that affect your goals? You mentioned a lot of companies are thinking about transformation now. How is that actually in practice from what you see?
So, first of all, I think a lot of us were surprised may not be the right word, but amazed at the way the country has gone through the COVID crisis. But let's remember that a lot of this was rooted in the hard work that had been done before that. You know, getting stability of the currency, stability of the banking system, some clear initiatives in getting new technologies adopted and all this. So that led to the country having very strong fundamentals that were tested during the COVID crisis, and they were tested and they resisted. And I think, so that's number one. I think number two, there is how the private sector and the different sectors actually embrace that confidence, which is what I mentioned earlier. Embrace that confidence. And that, I think that confidence has led practically to, first of all, being very well aware of what Vietnam means in the world, you know, from a trade perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, but also from an innovation perspective, what it means in Southeast Asia, beyond what we had heard a lot before about Singapore, Indonesia, and others. And then therefore, companies are actually taking opportunities to position themselves further. I can get into more details, but
sure,
that's...
yeah. Well, today's topic is about net zero, green bonds. I'm sure you guys are doing quite a bit of work into that. And that is a crucial business and investment issue facing Vietnam right now. But before we go into that, what are some other top-level highlights, perhaps digital transformation, for instance, that you see? And then we'll get into the net zero stuff.
Yeah. So first of all, I think the topic that you and I talked about a year ago, or a little bit more than that, the ecosystem logic, which is where industries get together into an aggregated value proposition, which is primarily delivered online, but not necessarily. That logic is still very much at play, and that logic is still very much behind what we see in China, definitely, but in Indonesia, for example. So that, I think, will continue. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's a second phase of digitization, where the first phase is obviously the one that you show, consumers, you know, mastering the right way to deliver a product, a service, changing your offering, and so on. The other side of it, which is the enterprise side of it, the automation, the leverage of data, and predictability. I think that is the next big wave, which is number two. Number three is what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is adapting to sustainability. But I think they are still, so that these are the three overall across sectors. Then there is one which I think is very much related to, in my view, to manufacturing moving forward, right? Because we've talked a lot about Vietnam as a manufacturing hub. Then we talked a lot about 2 or 3 years ago about Vietnam benefiting from China Plus One and relocation. We have talked a little bit less about how to get more value add, going up the value chain from a manufacturing perspective. And what does that mean in terms of sectors to be targeted? And what does that mean in terms of adoption of technologies? And what does that mean in terms of reimagining those supply chains?
That's a great feedback there, Bruce. And right after Bruce, we're actually going to have Alex, the managing director of Heineken, talk about that, because you guys know Heineken has a huge manufacturing hub in Vietnam, but they're also an innovation hub. It's literally in practice here, what Bruce is explaining. So looking forward to the Heineken session about that. Bruce, let's jump into net zero. COP27 in Egypt just happened. That was right off the back of COP26 in Scotland, where Vietnam made a big pledge about reaching net zero, I believe, by 2050. Yeah. A lot of people are saying that's going to be difficult, but manageable. What obstacles, though, are those exactly that stand in the way of that net zero goal?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, as you said, everything that we've witnessed in 2021 and 2022 in terms of intent has been very good. There's been revision of targets, whether it's getting down by 43.5 by 2030 or to zero in 2050 is very good. What was also very good, I think, is to put some of these things into practice, to be a little bit more granular around the shift into renewable energy, the shift into electrical vehicle, the shift into some strict guidelines on deforestation by 2030. So all this is great, right? Now, what gets into the in the way, and we can take a few examples later, is that there are two questions. The first question is, what has been announced so far? Does it lead to net zero or not? Right? And then we've looked at a number of scenarios, optimistic scenarios, more pessimistic, and with everything that has been announced, and with the extensive use of new technology, we are not quite there yet. We are definitely closing the gap, but not quite there yet. So the first question is, how do we close that gap, right? And so the first answer to your question is there are a few other things to really tackle and announce to close that gap, so that's one. Number two is to get organized and make it happen, right? Which is a structure in place, a journey timeline, and then number three, I think, is related to the financing of it. I have maybe one data point, right? When we talk about getting to net zero, of course, it's going to be very costly. $30 billion per year, private and public, over the next decade or so. But actually, we will be benefiting from it. And there are areas in getting to net zero that are actually cost negative, which means we actually save cost or make money out of it.
Is it difficult to convince clients and partners, though, that it is a net positive in terms of costs? Or
well, it's not difficult to convince the ones that know they will be cost negative, which is very much in the renewable energy. So we know that lifelong economics will favor wind, solar. So that is great, right? Then there is something in the middle which is close to pivot point, related to agriculture and so on. And then there is what's going to be very expensive, which are technologies that we don't fully master today, like CCUS, green steel, and everything that comes with it. That will take a little bit more time, and this is where the convincing may be a little bit more challenging. But overall, that's what it is.
Follow-up question to that. Do you find yourself needing to initiate those conversations with your partners and clients, or do you see them coming to you for that advice? What are you seeing more of? Is it split? Where is that relationship?
That's the core question. That's a great one. Things have been shifting, obviously, and then we see definitely more proactiveness, right? So the different types of questions. The first is, I need to have an ESG plan, right? And I need to announce my own targets. So how would that plan look like? Which is, again, announcing, right? Then there is then you get into the second question, which is my own carbon footprint as an organization. So that one is also well in the way, most of the time. And then number three, there is, so fundamentally changing the way I produce and being less carbon intensive. So that part is where that leads to transformative programs, right? And here, I think we see both push and pull, provided that financing is there.
Okay. Are Vietnamese companies suited to work on this task? I know the international ones, and there's quite a few of them here, are familiar with it. Maybe they're coming from a global mandate. Teams have been educated on it. Do you find the Vietnamese peers to be at the same level? Or above, perhaps, even, in some cases?
So, first of all, I think there is one thing we always say, but I think it's probably even more true for Vietnam, which is there's not much choice, right? You need to embrace it. In fact, I can't remember, there was a report mentioning that Vietnam was probably one of the top 5 countries that would be impacted by global warming in general. And then, in fact, when we're here in Ho Chi Minh City, between now and 2050, we could be in a situation where flood depth could actually go threefold. And just thinking of this leads to a $15 to $20 billion investment just to cover what would be the implications and the consequence of it. So there's definitely urgency, which leads to companies, wherever they are, to proactively embrace it. And I think it's not only companies, but it's also what we see in the provinces in Vietnam, which actually we're very happy with. I think, if I'm not wrong, the Quang Nam province, for example, was piloting some carbon sink projects. The Dak Nong province is looking into green aluminium, and Ninh Binh and Quang Ninh, if I'm exact, are the ones that are proactively in their plans looking into renewable energy and so on. So you definitely see that push in the plan as well.
So it's not just in the cities, you're seeing it in the provinces.
Exactly right.
That explains why you're never in the city, right, Bruce? You're always out of town.
Well, half-half.
Half-half. If we have some visuals to showcase in a little bit too, by the way, guys.
Yes, I forgot the cue. Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna put them up here so you guys can visualize a few. McKinsey has done quite a number of reports on this. This is a bit of an exclusive here that we're seeing. Bruce, maybe you can explain what we're reading here a little bit.
Yes. So here you see the projections that we've looked at from what we call GSG, which is greenhouse gas emission over the next until 2050. And we see both what is the current policies or the current policies plus, and then we see what we've modeled in terms of getting to net zero. And those charts, those bars that you see there are actually an aggregation of all different industries that will need to have a specific plan to get to net zero. So
can you explain the one in black, LULUCF? What is that term?
That's related to the land use, and everything related to deforestation and so on.
So it grows a lot over
actually,
couple decades.
So this is the scenario that gets us to zero, right?
Okay.
If we consider that the base is actually the fact that 30% today is transportation, 30% power, 30% industry and 10% transportation, and then for each of those sectors, there are clear initiatives to proactively put in place, both in the public sector and private sector, that gets us to net zero. And that comes with, which is probably the second part of your question on the challenges, because that comes with challenges that are very much related to Vietnam itself. So, the elongated geography of Vietnam makes the realization of a fast speed train between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City probably more difficult than it is in other countries, right? 1,600 kilometers and so on, which in itself could be a $50 billion project. So there are pros in the power sector and also in the transportation sector on the electrical vehicle. And then there are things that are more challenging to tackle, such as what I just mentioned, right? So all this becomes an equation which can only be looked at holistically, which I think is what the government is doing, and that needs to be derived and translated at the sector level and at the company level.
Very good. And before we just continue here, guys, I want to explain why we wanted to have Bruce lead off about a net zero discussion, because of the 150 podcasts we've done, we've actually noticed anything related to green bonds, ESG, net zero. We've only done a few episodes, but actually in recent months has been the most downloaded episodes. And that tells us a lot about what especially young people are thinking about as well, not just businesses. If you guys follow me on Instagram or LinkedIn, last night I just posted, what are your favorite episodes? And I was offering some free tickets to some youngsters that are students who can't afford the ticket price, I wanted to have them come here today and share what episodes are interesting them the most. And a lot of them mentioned this topic, in addition to a lot of the other topics we're featuring today. So exciting to see those trends, and hopefully more to be shared.
But then, on this point, actually,
yeah.
Vietnam is in this situation where all these transformations happen at the same time. You know, last year we talked about digital transformation ecosystem, now this path on sustainability and all that, which is a great chance because in the past we've seen a lot of countries leapfrogging simply because they could get right to the next level without having through the legacy of what had been put in place before, if you follow the evolution of technology and so on. I think it's a great chance too.
Okay, excellent. We just got a couple more questions, guys, and that'll conclude today's fireside chat with Bruce. If we have more visuals, by the way, just remember, we have one more?
No, that's
this is it? Okay,
that's it.
We're going to keep it up there then. Why would you recommend investors or businesses, both abroad or here in Vietnam, to consider Vietnam for green financing over its other peers? There's tons of other countries in Southeast Asia to pick the lot from. You've covered the whole region. You used to live in Indonesia for some time. Why Vietnam compared to anyone else?
In the context of green or in general?
Okay. Net zero. Yeah.
So I think the first is everything that we just talked about, which is the investment opportunities, both qualitative and quantitative, whether it's infrastructure. I think 2021 was around 38 billion in terms of project finance. I mean, that starts to get really significant, and investors clearly would want to take part of it. And then we see that we've seen that happening already, right? So that's number one. Across renewables, which is happening, transportation, industry, and so on. There is one element in the equation which is not quite there, which is going to be important, which is green financing. And this is where the comparison with other countries is actually very interesting, because you see, if you look at the past 5 years, the emission of green bonds, which is typically the instrument you use for green financing, on the project finance perspective, right? Not on capital markets, right, or what we call transaction banking. It was around $43 billion, right? If I'm not wrong, last year for Vietnam, accumulated over the past 5 years, was not even 300 million. So that says a few things, right? So number one, and this would need to improve and increase, and that's going to be important moving forward. So is there enough projects to be green financed? The answer is yes. Is there any challenge from a profitability perspective? Because obviously issuers and bankers and investors and want to make money out of it. So that is part of the current equation with the current, but generally there's no, the premium is not negative between normal corporate bonds and green bonds, even there's what we call the greenium, which is the green premium. Number three is the legal framework, right? So there was some announcement in 2018 by the government to make sure that the banks actually started to take into account green as part of their overall risk assessment. It needs to go a little bit beyond that. Why? Because when it got beyond that, for example, in Indonesia, this is really when things took off in conjunction with banks and financial institutions actually embracing it. And that's exactly what happened in Indonesia, where a relatively small-scale bank actually managed to be one of the first issuer of green bonds, and now we are in the billions as opposed to in the millions here. I think today 40% of banks are not doing green financing. Some are actively getting into it. But overall, the size of revenues for banks in 5 years, all considered, right, which is this, right, could be $1.3 to $1.5 billion in revenue. And so there's something for banks to gain. And if they get into it, there is something for net zero to gain. And then there is something for Vietnam to gain from a sustainable transformation perspective. That's the last part of the equation.
Okay. So guys, a few takeaways from today's fireside chat with Bruce. Doing a lot of digital, doing a lot of net zero, He's hiring a lot, so if you guys are looking for a job, perhaps McKinsey, Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. And lastly, he's looking for a music producer still. So if you have any, you or anyone else.
Amongst other things.
There we go. Last question for you, Bruce. And I always like to ask this at the end of every single podcast as well. Based on you listening to all these shows, and I understand a lot of the McKinsey folks that have come and gone through the firm have listened to the show before joining McKinsey as well. Who else would you like to see on the show? It doesn't have to be a person. It could be a company, an industry. For instance, I asked this question to the head of development at Radisson, which only has 4 hotels, but is growing to 30 in the next few years in Vietnam. And he said, I wanted to hear from an airline. And then we got an airline executive here today. Pierre, there you are, from Bamboo. Go find him. He's in the front row. Founding member of Bamboo, acting chief commercial officer, so airline guy here. How about you? What are you curious about?
Oh, that's the question I didn't prepare.
No specific names. It's okay.
Okay.
Could be anything.
So I'll give you an easy answer. Because of everything we said, right? Which is everyone is actually, from a sustainability perspective, then all players and all stakeholders need to be part of the show, which is very different from 2 years ago when it was about innovation in different sectors, right? So more specifically, I think you may want to hear from the provinces themselves, right? I think that would be a great thing. If I would be very interested to know what some provinces are putting in place in addition to what we discuss for Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. That would be one. I would also be very interested. I know you did something with the ambassador of the US some time ago, which had nothing to do with that. But hearing a little bit more from what other countries are actually actively doing with the government, that would be great. And then, of course, diversifying sectors beyond what you've already done.
Okay. We'll be hearing from the U.S. Consul General later today, actually, Susan Burns. She's, I think, appearing at 2:15 p.m. She's just arrived in Saigon a week or 2 ago, so stay for that, Bruce, if you can.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you,
today.
Bruce.
Thank you very much,
everyone.
everyone.
Yeah.
Have a great day.